The call came on a Thursday morning in late January 2002. A mid-level auditor at Bankgesellschaft Berlin sat at his desk, coffee going cold beside him, staring at a number that refused to make sense. He checked it again. Then a third time. The figure on the screen, $7.2 billion in real estate loan guarantees, pointed back to a single source, a man named Klaus Landowsky. A man who, until that morning, had been considered one of the most powerful bankers in all of Germany. The auditor picked up the phone. He had no idea that what he was about to report would collapse an institution over a century old, erase the life savings of thousands of ordinary Berliners, and send shockwaves through the reunified German state. He had no idea, but he made the call anyway. And that is where this story begins. To understand how a city nearly bankrupted itself, you have to go back to November 9th, 1989. The Berlin Wall falls, the two Germanys are suddenly one, and the euphoria is total. West Germany is pouring money eastward. Property developers are salivating. Berlin is about to become the capital of a reunited European superpower, and everyone with access to capital wants a piece of the coming boom. Into this moment steps Bankgesellschaft Berlin, a state-backed banking conglomerate assembled in 1994 from the merger of several regional institutions. On paper, it was an act of civic pride. Berlin's own bank, backed by the city government, built to finance the reconstruction of the capital. Its board was stacked with politicians. Its mandate was practically sacred. And its most prominent executive was Klaus Landowsky, tall, silver-haired, a member of the Christian Democratic Union Party, a man who moved between the boardroom and the legislature with the ease of someone who had never once been told no. Landowsky was not a banker in any technical sense. He was a political operator. He understood that in post-reunification Berlin, the line between public money and private ambition was not just blurred. It was non-existent. He served simultaneously on the bank's board and in the Berlin House of Representatives. He had friends in construction. He had friends in real estate. And beginning in the mid-1990s, he began directing the bank's real estate investment funds into a series of deals that defied any conventional understanding of sound lending. Properties were appraised at multiples of their actual value. Loans were extended on assets that barely existed. Guarantees were issued, tens of millions, then hundreds of millions, then billions, without meaningful collateral. And the documents authorizing all of it bore the signatures of men who either did not look closely enough or chose not to. The scheme was not elegant. That is what makes it so disturbing. It was not a sophisticated algorithmic fraud. It was not a web of shell companies buried across 5 jurisdictions. It was, at its core, an abuse of institutional trust so brazen it could only survive in a place where the watchdogs were also the wolves. The real estate funds, sold to ordinary German retail investors as safe, city-backed products, were quietly being used as vehicles to prop up failing property deals that Landowsky and his associates had already approved at grossly inflated prices. When the Berlin property market failed to deliver the post-reunification miracle everyone had promised, those deals began curdling, and the losses had to go somewhere. They went to the investors. By 1999, internal documents at Bankgesellschaft Berlin were already flagging catastrophic exposure in the real estate portfolios. Memos circulated. Numbers were revised downward, then revised again. One internal risk assessment from October 2000, later obtained by investigators, used the German word existenzbedrohend, existentially threatening, to describe the bank's position. That memo was filed, and the bank kept selling the funds, kept collecting fees, kept issuing guarantees, and Klaus Landowsky kept attending CDU fundraisers where, according to testimony given years later, he accepted cash donations from property developers whose projects the bank had just financed. The donation that would eventually surface publicly was 40,000 Deutsche Marks,
handed to Landowsky at a party function in 1995 by a developer named Aubis, a company that had received hundreds of millions in loans from the bank Landowsky helped run. It was the kind of detail that sounds almost too on the nose, too movie villain obvious, but that is exactly what happened. And it would not become public knowledge until the entire institution was already on fire. By the time that auditor made his call in January 2002, Bankgesellschaft Berlin was facing a total exposure of approximately 21.6 billion euros in real estate loan guarantees, a number so large it exceeded the annual budget of the city of Berlin itself. The state government, which held a controlling stake in the bank, was now staring into an abyss of its own making. Because the bank had been sold to the public as safe, government-backed, responsible, thousands of Berliners, pensioners, school teachers, civil servants had invested their savings in the real estate funds. They had been told the city itself stood behind the product. They had believed it. Why wouldn't they? The collapse accelerated in February 2002. Bankgesellschaft Berlin posted a loss of 1.75 billion euros for the year 2001. The announcement was made on a Monday. By Wednesday, a run had begun. Not a violent one. No lines around the block. No broken windows. A quiet one. The kind where phones ring all day in branch offices and people speak in carefully controlled voices, asking to move their money, please, as soon as possible. The CDU-led Berlin government scrambled. An emergency bailout of 1.755 billion euros was approved using taxpayer funds. Then another tranche, then another. By the time the bleeding stopped, the city of Berlin had poured over 6 billion euros into the institution, just to keep it from taking the city's finances down with it. The political party that had overseen it all, the CDU, lost the Berlin state election that autumn in a historic collapse. They did not recover that majority for decades. Landowsky resigned from the bank's supervisory board in February 2002, just as the scale of the disaster was becoming impossible to hide. He resigned from the Berlin legislature the following month. In the photograph taken as he left the Parliament building for the last time, he was wearing a dark grey overcoat, collar turned up, eyes fixed somewhere off to his left, as if the cameras were not worth acknowledging. He would later say, in a formal statement, that he bore political but not legal responsibility for the crisis. That phrase would become famous in Berlin, famous for what it revealed about the man. The criminal investigation moved slowly. German financial prosecutions always do. But investigators at the Berlin Public Prosecutor's Office, led in part by senior prosecutor Regina Voss, who had spent years building financial crime cases, began piecing together the full architecture of the fraud. They found the Aubis donation. They found the inflated appraisals. They found internal memos that had been deliberately withheld from auditors. They found evidence that multiple executives had signed off on guarantees they knew to be fraudulent, then approved accounting treatments designed to bury the losses across subsidiaries. In April 2004, Klaus Landowsky and several co-defendants went on trial at Berlin Regional Court. The courtroom was large and formal and smelled of old wood and heating oil. Landowsky sat in the second row of the defendant's section in a dark blue suit, flanked by attorneys whose fees were reportedly among the highest in Germany. He was charged with breach of fiduciary duty. The charge carries a maximum of 5 years in German law. It does not carry the weight of the victims in the gallery, some of them elderly, some of them having lost retirement savings they could never recover, believed it should. The trial ran for over 2 years. Witnesses contradicted each other. Documents were challenged. Landowsky's defense argued consistently that every decision had been made in good faith under real estate market projections that, while wrong, had been held across the industry. The prosecution countered that internal documents proved the risk was known and concealed. On November 30th, 2006, the verdict came. Landowsky was found guilty. His sentence, 1 year and 8 months, suspended. He did not spend a single night in prison. 3 of his co-defendants received similarly suspended sentences. The former CEO of one subsidiary was fined. The fines, in absolute terms, were a fraction of the losses suffered by the victims. A woman named Gerda Hoffman, not her real name, but the composite used in advocacy reports compiled by investor protection groups at the time, had invested 60,000 euros in one of the Bankgesellschaft real estate funds. It represented nearly everything she had saved across 30 years of work as a school administrator. She received a payout of roughly 30 cents on the euro. She was 64 years old. The broader impact settled over Berlin like sediment. The city spent years paying down the bailout debt. Social programs were cut. Infrastructure projects delayed. Berliners were, in a literal sense, paying for the corruption of their own gov.
Ernment-backed bank long after Landowsky had retired to comfortable obscurity. A 2007 report by the Berlin Audit Court estimated the total cost to taxpayers, factoring in guarantees, bailout tranches, and ongoing fund losses, at approximately 35 billion euros over the life cycle of the damage. Not all of that was crime. Some was incompetence, but the distinction stopped mattering to the people paying it. Bankgesellschaft Berlin itself was restructured, stripped, and eventually absorbed into Landesbank Berlin. The brand was retired in 2006. The physical headquarters, a glass tower on Alexanderplatz that had been built in the optimism of the early 1990s, was quietly sold. The new tenants renovated the lobby. They put plants near the entrance. Within a few years, there was no visible trace that the building had ever housed the apparatus of one of Germany's most consequential financial frauds. Klaus Landowsky never publicly expressed remorse in terms that satisfied his victims. He gave occasional interviews in the years following the trial. He described himself as a man who had worked in good faith during an extraordinary and turbulent period. He said the property market collapse was unforeseeable. He said a great deal. What he never said, not once in any recorded statement, was the word sorry. The auditor who made that phone call in January 2002 is not famous. His name does not appear in most summaries of the scandal. He gave testimony during the trial, was thanked briefly by the presiding judge, and returned to his life. He had done the one thing the entire system around him had failed to do for nearly a decade. He looked at a number that did not make sense, and instead of filing it away, he refused to let it go. In a story built entirely on people who chose not to see, that one quiet act of seeing deserves to sit here at the end, unadorned. The city of Berlin is still paying. The number is different now, smaller, wrapped in bureaucratic language, buried in municipal budget footnotes. But it is still there. Some debts do not disappear. They just change shape. They become the school that did not get renovated, the pension that came up short, the fund statement that a 64-year-old woman read alone at her kitchen table and did not fully understand until it was far too late. That is where the money went. Not into vaults, not offshore. Into the silence of people who knew and chose power over truth, and then walked out of a courthouse in a dark blue suit and went home.